Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing today? Let's on Friday we discussed a topic, and it was about uh, it was like colonialism, imperialism in 19th century, and how it is impacting the world today in the 21st century. And now we are going to discuss a similar topic which has historical significance, and it is impacting the world today. It's interwar totalitarianism and its impact on neoliberal era, and it's related to the totalitarianism in the world wars, especially the World War II, when Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and similar figures were uh, on the rise, and they were impacting the world. So now we are not going to waste much of your time. We are going to start this conversation. I have our guest, Mr. John Kofus from Greece. He's going to elaborate on this important topic. So let's welcome Mr. John B. Kofus. How are you, sir?
Good. Thank you very much, Assad. Welcome to everyone. Today's session, somewhat related to the previous one on 19th century imperialism and its impact on neoliberalism, and also the parallels between the age, what is called in history, the age of new imperialism, which is 1870 to 1914, and the parallels between 1990 and the present, how the global power structure is resembled. Today, the topic is on the impact of totalitarianism. In the neoliberal era, let me begin by, first of all, pointing out that the term totalitarianism was defined during the early Cold War by a number of scholars. Hannah Arendt was one of them. Basically, the term totalitarianism is a broad term which encompasses not only the fascist regime in Italy under Benito Mussolini, the Third Reich under Adolf Hitler, but also which, of course, were both of those were advancing capitalist interests, as we will see, within the respective countries and within their trading systems, both of those countries. But it also refers to the Soviet Union under Joseph. And the reason is because the common denominator was the strong state structure. Now, and the fact that everything was subordinated to the state. Benito Mussolini and a number of fascist political theorists argued that there was a slogan that stated nothing above the state, nothing against the state, everything within the state, implying that the state was the ultimate entity in society. And the question was, what did the state represent in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy? And then what did the state represent in communist countries like the Soviet Union? There is no doubt, by the way, at all, that Joseph Stalin was deviated very far from the Marxist model and went after enemies within the Communist Party, within the Russian, including the most famous, of course, who was Leon Trotsky, who was Vladimir Lenin's right-hand man, and the commissar for the Red Army, created the strong Red Army and prevailed during the Russian Civil War. Stalin was, in fact, a tyrannical figure and had a very strong state structure. And under the state, there was total control of society. Totalitarianism does refer to total control. Now, that's the kind of control we see also in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. However, there was no private sector. I want to underscore this. There was no capitalism in Stalin's Russia. Yes, he was tyrannical. Yes, he went after anyone resisting, not just Bolshevism, but resisting Stalinism, because under Stalin, the Bolshevik Revolution evolved to assume Joseph Stalin's personal stamp on the state structure. Loyalty was to Joseph Stalin, and his hero was not Marx or Lenin, it was one of the early czars, Ivan the Terrible. So it's understandable why people may throw in the Soviet Union under Stalin in this. But the question is, of course, how does totalitarianism today? I'm sorry. How does how does totalitarianism impact today's neoliberal era, the neoliberal era since the 1980s? And that's an important and controversial topic. One reason this is controversial is because for the last 3 decades or so, especially the last two decades, and most poignantly after Donald Trump won the election in the United States and openly began to use quotes from fascists, including Benito Mussolini. And then when he was asked about why are you using a quote like from someone who was an infamous fascist dictator, he said, well, not everything Mussolini did was bad. So, and then, of course, there was a famous speech that former President Barack Obama made where he warned that the United States could go down the road. This is, of course, after Trump won, could go down the road of fascism, that the United States was, in fact, down that road. That's one reason for the in the popular mind that there is a link. Now, I want to make sure that people understand that there is a difference between what is called classical fascism, which, of course, as regime, it started in Italy in 1922 under Benito Mussolini. As an ideology, by the way, it starts in the late 19th century in Europe, including in France, by the way. Now, the first regime was that of Italy. The second was that of Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. The question is, what is fascism and what's the difference between fascism and Nazism, and how is that related to current neoliberal political conditions? Fascism is an eclectic ideology. It borrowed from a number of sources, including, by the way, aspects of socialism, making concessions to workers as a populist movement, because the core of fascism is populism. And we see neoliberal populist leaders today, from Viktor Orban in Hungary to Modi to Trump in the United States, to Bolsonaro in Brazil. All of the authoritarian neoliberals are populists. They all have that in common. Now, fascism includes nationalism, aspects of socialism. It includes social Darwinism, which implies supremacy of a certain race or ethnic group. Social Darwinism is different than the theory of evolution that the biologist Charles Darwin developed. Social Darwinism has nothing to do with Charles Darwin. It's a theory that was developed by other late 19th century thinkers, which is based on white supremacy, by the way, namely that certain people, that there is a hierarchy in ethnic populations, racial populations in the world, and that certain people are higher in that hierarchy than others, and that is an innate condition. Social Darwinism was an integral part, especially of the Nazi ideology, and that is what Adolf used to proceed with the Holocaust, but also many people only associate Hitler with the Jewish Holocaust. Many people do not know that he also went after Jews, by the way, and eliminated um, um, hundreds of thousands of gypsies. Now, those who embraced social Darwinism and were far right wing were not limited to just Nazi Germany, by the way. There was fascism in Italy after 1922, in Germany after January 1933. But then there were authoritarian regimes that had acts of Nazi and fascist ideology, which includes, by the way, again, I want to pause here and point out that it includes, besides nationalism and social Darwinism, it includes chauvinism, it includes militarism as an essential part of the ideology. It includes hatred for not just for communism, although they stressed that, by the way, because it was convenient after the Bolshevik Revolution to attract people who were afraid of communism, especially religious people, and Protestant alike in the West, and in these countries, the Orthodox. They used anti-Bolshevism, but they were also adamantly against the liberal ideology. So and this is not just in Europe, by the way, in Eastern and Western Europe and Southern Europe, as we'll see. Emperor Hirohito in Japan, who did become effectively a dictator, and Japan became part of the Axis, which included Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan was in the same boat. So we have an ideology that is based on exclusion of certain people based on political views, liberals, communists, pacifists, as well as racial groups, ethnic groups. This is a very important component. My first exposure to fascism was in the early 1980s when Reagan was in the White House and Thatcher was the Prime Minister of England, and I wrote a book on fascism in Greece. In fact, the publisher said, "No, we're not going to accept that title. You have to change the title to Authoritarianism in Greece." And I did. And Greece had, from 1936 to 1941, a regime under a dictator who was openly pro-Nazi. And there were aspects of the regime that were pro-Nazi, influenced by the dictatorship, the authoritarian regime in Portugal under Antonio Salazar. That regime under Estado Novo, which was the new state in Portuguese, that's what that means, was also pro-fascist. However, there is a difference between the authoritarian regimes that sprang up from Portugal after 1936 in Spain under Francisco Franco. Well, 1939, I should say, after Francisco Franco. 1936 to 1939, there was a civil war in Spain, and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany supported Francisco Franco, as did some of the Western countries, fortunately, and Western corporations supported Franco, who was openly pro-fascist. But also a number of the Balkan countries had pro-fascist governments, but all authoritarian, because fascism is really linked to not a traditional military dictatorship as we have, from the 19th century to today, military dictatorships, but especially rather, to a police state. The police, and this is most prominent in Germany. In Germany, the SS, which was the policing network, was actually very powerful. And it was sort of the personal bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard of the Führer, of Adolf Hitler. So fascism really does imply a mass base that the party network has, a paramilitary organization. In the case of both Germany and Italy, the paramilitary organizations, for Italy, they were called black shirts because they wore black shirts. But it was a paramilitary organization. It served as illegal. In Germany, it was the SA, which was replaced eventually by the SS once Hitler took power. He got rid of the SA. So we have a unique situation now with fascism and Nazism. This is why a lot of people are hesitant to argue that in the neoliberal era, have full-blown fascist conditions. And when I was writing the book, my mentor, and who later became in fascism, he was one of the experts, Alexander de Gran, who was one of the international experts in fascism, was my professor. And he was by a world famous scholar in Italy. His name is Renzo De Felice, who had written enormous amounts of work, a number of works on fascism in Italy, and he wanted to make sure, and Alex de Grand, whom I studied and who was a colleague also, believed also that you can't use the term fascism loosely, as a lot of people use it today, and say, well, this regime, just because it has some authoritarian tendencies, is fascist. However, in the latest book that I did on neoliberalism, and I'm doing extensive research on this book, and looked at a lot of documents and analysis, what becomes clear is that there are a lot of similarities between fascist regimes of the interwar period, the totalitarian era, and our neoliberal era. And the most deceptive aspect of all this is that today, these fascist traits, it's not full-blown fascism, no doubt, operate under the parliamentary system. In other words, the democratic process. So whether it's in the United States or in France or in Italy, by the way, which under Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy right now, okay, who has pro-fascist, classical pro-fascist ideological leanings and political leanings, although she follows the status quo, pro-NATO, pro-US, she's not rocking the boat, but is openly, and one on that basis, far right wing. In France, there is a political party, which is the second largest, which is in fact pro-fascist as well. In the United States, it's interesting that it is the Trump party, the GOP, the Republican Party. In India, the Modi's government is leaning that way. The question is, do we call them fascist? I would say that it's a loaded term, and there's no reason to use the term. I agree with my former mentors that it's a stretch. However, it is alarming globally to see this phenomenon of elected relying so heavily on ideological and policy and political foundations of the interwar fascist era. That in itself is alarming, and it is taking place under neoliberalism. And the question is why? Why does neoliberalism have such an attraction to the fascist ideology and political system? There have been scholarly works that have been done on this. People have, including country by country, whether it's Hungary under Viktor Orban or India, by the way. Indian scholars have done quite a bit on Modi on this issue, openly arguing the regime has very clear fascist tendencies. Now, that's what we want to explore today as far as a little bit of background. I want to stop and ask if you have any questions so far and see what you think.
Uh, Mr. Kofus, as of now, I don't have any questions. You can continue the conversation.
Okay, I wanna begin by arguing that just as in the interwar period, fascism arises out of a crisis, and the crisis was born from the destruction of the world economy as a result of World War I. In fact, many Europeans defeated World War I as it was defeated World War II. Many Europeans, again, especially Germans, had the sense that it was the decline of the West. Just like today, there are scholars in the Western world who believe that we are undergoing a decline of the West, namely the transatlantic Western alliance, primarily because of the rise of China. The ascendancy of China necessarily entails the decline of the West, and the West desperately looking at the military option as leverage to maintain the previous glory that it had during the Cold War. So one of the things that happens that results in the rise of fascism is Europe's destruction in World War One, and it is no accident. And the devastation of the economy, it's no accident that Italy becomes the first victim in this case, by the way, because Italy, although Italy, many people, unless of course they have studied the history of Italy and history of 20th century Europe, they would have no reason to know this. Italy was actually on the side of the Allies, on Britain, on the side of Britain, France, and the United States in the First War. It was in the second, it was on the side of the Third Reich of Germany. But in the first, it was actually on the side of the Western powers. But although it was on the side of the winners, it came out a loser. Its economy was devastated. People were desperate. And out of this economic malaise, out of this economic destruction, Mussolini emerges with only 5% of the vote. And Emmanuel II appoints him prime minister. And by 1925, he became full-fledged dictator under one-party state, the fascist state. So there is the one thing to consider is that out of an economic crisis, what happens historically, governments will use the economic crisis as a pretext to argue that the solution is an authoritarian government. In this case, a full-fledged fascist regime. And fascist regime meant for Benito Mussolini, especially after 1925, and I'll connect this to neoliberalism, is there's a famous document called the Palazzo Bedoni Agreement, where Hitler did the same, something analogous, by the way, in Germany, where he got together with bankers, industrialists, agricultural interests, and he agreed that he would serve their interests by controlling the labor movement and wage rises. He could contain wage costs for the manufacturers, for the business sector, and in return, they would have to be loyal to him in government and support him. So they exchange loyalty to the state for support, for economic policy support. That was the agreement. They kept to that agreement, and he kept to his agreement. Hitler, by the way, had a similar agreement. He had it up right away. Mussolini waited 3 years to do this agreement. Hitler had it right away. He too met with bankers, industrialists, the elites, the business sector elites of Germany, and told them that I'm going to advance your interests will be safeguarded. We will advance your interests. Labor will be controlled. And in return, they had to be loyal. They could not question what he was doing. They could not question his social policy, his labor policy, or his racial policy, because Hitler also had a plan to, of course, eliminate the Jews. And of course, along with those, there were also the Gypsies in Europe that he went after, the Gypsies as well. So the economic crisis of Europe as a result of World War I leads to these regimes. Now, how could they justify it? They used fear. Fear of what? Bolshevism. Fear that communism is going to spread. And this fear was very effective. This fear was used, by the way, by emperor in the 1930s. He too cracked down once he became a full-fledged dictator after 1932. Japan had already annexed Manchuria and renamed it after a Japanese name, Manchukuo. Emperor Hirohito emerges as this far right-wing dictator, and he too used the anti-Bolshevism argument. We have to remember, by the way, that Japan is a neighbor of a lot of people in the West probably don't associate, but it's a neighbor of Russia because it's right there if you look on the other side of the Pacific. So we see this not just in the West, but we see it in the East as well. And we see it in Latin America, in Brazil, for example. Under Getulio Vargas, Brazil did the same thing. The communist card was always played to justify far right-wing regimes. The only two major countries that escaped this fate were the United States under FDR, which went towards social democracy, and the other country was a bit later in the 1930s was France, under Leon Blum, who was a socialist. Spain tried to avoid this route also in 1933 to 1936, but it didn't last because the forces of opposition, the coalition of the business sector, the Catholic Church, very powerful in Spain, the agricultural interests, the large landowners, coalesced under General Francisco Franco. In 1936, they studied Hitler and Mussolini, and eventually they prevailed, by the way, as well as I pointed out, Western corporations as well, and eventually they prevailed. So fascism becomes a very prevalent in the interwar period, in part because there is a universal fear of Bolshevism. I want the audience to understand something, and this is something I actually saw. I think it was in 1987, 88. I can't remember, it so long ago. But one of the brilliant former Soviet analysts, his name is Georgy Arbatov. He was an advisor on Soviet-American relations to 5 different secretary generals of the Soviet Union. Yeah, I remember him going on American television, one of those Sunday morning political analyst shows, and he said to George Will, famous conservative commentator representing, of course, he was a full-fledged neoliberal Reagan supporter. He said to him, you know, we in the Soviet Union are going to do something very horrible to you, to the United States. And George Will was, you know, he was alarmed when Arbatov said something like that on national television. And he said, what will you do to us? He said, we're going to deprive you of an enemy. You're not going to have an enemy anymore. Now, a lot of people would probably laugh at a statement like that, what Arbatov said. But actually, having an enemy is extremely important to justify, for a government to justify what it intends to do, which is usually a horrible thing. The United States justified a lot of what it was doing throughout the Cold War. We have an enemy, the Soviets, among other communists, of course, the Chinese. In the interwar period, the enemy was still the Soviet Union. It was the Bolsheviks. Now, Arbatov, as it turns out, in his prophecy of depriving an enemy, was wrong, because the West still, although communism is over, there is no communism. As we know, it's one capitalist system across the entire world. Russia is still an enemy because you can't justify NATO expansionism and the neoliberal system, which is based on class warfare, the doctrine of class warfare, and unequal distribution of wealth socially and geographically. In other words, socially within a country, you have rising inequality, and geographically within the capitalist system, the global south gets fewer and fewer of the world GDP. If you look at world GDP statistics, you'll see which countries are at the core countries are at the top, and the bottom 170 countries share the list of the world's GDP. So so having an enemy, Arbertov in his wisdom was right, except of course that that's not the way it happened. The enemy is still the same, and the reason is because the enemy is needed, as it was needed in the interwar period, for Benito Mussolini, Emperor Hirohito, Adolf Hitler, all of them, whenever they were doing something, well, we have the communists. What do you want, me or the communists? And Hitler, by the way, as well as Mussolini, as well as Francisco Franco, Antonio Salazar, Emperor Hitler, all of them used the exact same, you want me, you want them. And people hesitate, yeah, we'll take this, because the alternative is worse. Okay, so this is a very important consideration to keep in mind. Now, I want to, first of all, let me pause again and ask you if you have any questions on other things. Go ahead.
You can continue, sir.
Okay, let me point out that the institutions of fascism evolved around a corporatist model, as it's called. The fact is that the state was the ultimate arbiter. The state had the agreement with the private sector. We will pursue policies, that the state will pursue policies which will advance, and they did advance, by the way, the economic interests of the private sector, of capital. That's exactly what happened. And how will we do that? They did it through coercion and force. They did it because they controlled the labor movement. They made sure that workers' demands for higher wages were kept under control. Trade unions were under their control. So they made sure that labor did not defy the government and make demands on them. Now, class warfare was an essential part of fascism. Class warfare is an essential neoliberalism. The difference is in the fact that under neoliberalism, the state is in a position where, under various mechanisms, from lobbying groups to law firms through business liaisons to government, communicates the policy that it wants the government to pursue, and the government goes along with that policy, whether that is in terms of the fiscal structure. The fiscal structure, I think I've mentioned this before, is extremely important, by the way, whether it was in the interwar period under the fascists or today. It's very important because the fiscal structure necessarily entails redistribution of income. If you keep the taxes of the lower classes, the middle classes, lower the taxes of the upper classes, you're redistributing wealth. It's that simple. That means you're using the income of certain groups, certain social groups, to fund the expenses of the state, and other groups, namely the wealthiest, are paying the least in terms of the percentage of wealth they own proportionally to the taxes they pay. That's very important to consider, because there are a lot of people saying, well, someone who makes $2 billion pays more taxes than someone who makes $10,000 a year. Well, obviously, someone who makes $10,000 a year can't pay $1 million or $10 million in taxes because they make $10,000. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But in any case, the fiscal structure is a mechanism of redistributing wealth. And policy under the fascists and policy under the neoliberals was intended to promote capital. The other very important element of this is militarism. The fascists did not come out of nowhere, by the way. They came out of the European tradition. Fascism did not come from another planet. It comes from the historical roots of Europe, of European culture and European traditions. Fascism comes out of the traditional conservative culture of Europe, political culture of Europe. The political conservatives and the economic conservatives agree that that democracy was a hindrance because it meant not just political equality in terms of the right to vote, which people had in a lot of the advanced countries, but it meant giving them increasingly social equality, addressing social justice, because that's what they demanded, especially trade unions. They argued that there's a difference between political democracy and economic democracy. Economic democracy means, why am I the one producing all of this wealth, but I'm getting a tiny share of the return out of the product I'm producing, and the owner, the employer, is getting the lion's share of all that. So the issue was one of making sure that the masses, that the working classes and middle classes are kept from making demands. And in both Italy and in Nazi Germany, as well as across Europe, like I said, the exceptions, France, Leon Blum's France, somewhat in England, by the way. England did have fascists, but it never had a viable fascist party. All countries had fascist parties, by the way. All countries had fascist parties. Just like today, they have neo-fascist and neo-Nazi parties in Europe. There was pressure to look at the working class as an enemy. And the working class, in the view of the elites, was identified if they as much as made demands for social justice, for more equity, for greater pay, for greater equity in gender pay. They were labeled socialists or communists. And once the Bolshevik Revolution took place, that was an easy label to stick with people. And in some countries, for example, in Germany and in Italy, you couldn't get a job unless the state approved you. In Italy, you needed essentially to make sure, in most cases, to get a job. In Germany, it was even worse. They began firing people who were known communists. They didn't go after the Jews, by the way. There's Jews, of course, were dismissed as journalists. They were dismissed from universities, from schools, simply because they were Jews. But also the leftists, communists and leftists, were also dismissed. So the system became so rigid that it eliminated those who were not conforming. Now, totalitarianism means, I had this in the back of my mind, totalitarianism means not just mechanical obedience to the ideology that the state is pursuing, but spiritual obedience. They wanted the complete submission of the individual to the state. So the individual belongs to the state. Now, It is true that neoliberalism, which has libertarian traits to it and prizes itself on celebrating the individual, differs in that respect. That is true. However, neoliberalism is also insistent on conformity of the individual within the perimeters of the system. So neoliberalism permits you to be what you and I have discussed before, and that is a consumer citizen with a free will, a consumer citizen. So within that context, of course, you have free will, you can do whatever you want, but not outside that structure, that framework. You can't go, in other words, against the system and say, well, how about addressing larger issues that are systemic and go to the heart of social justice? Or how about addressing a foreign policy that is based on aggressive militarist action that kills innocent people in the global south? Can't do that. Just like you couldn't do that in fascist Italy when it invaded Ethiopia, or in Imperial Japan when it took over Manchuria, in other words, the northeast of China, which is known as Manchuria, where Beijing is, or when Hitler began to expand from Austria to Poland. And you can't question the foreign policy of the state, no matter how harsh it is. So in this respect, they're now in the 21st century, under neoliberalism, the mechanisms are much more subtle. And I realize that they're so subtle that people hardly notice them. For one thing, we have a mass media that thoroughly indoctrinates the population, and people accept as the norm that which is undemocratic. You use the term democracy to mean popular sovereignty, for example. And if you use the term democracy and do not associate it with militarist adventures and repression of other people, using military means to repress other people. So this is a different era. This is an era of high-tech technology. This is an era of mass communications. This is an era of mass indoctrination. They did not have those means in the interwar. In the interwar, however, I must point out that propaganda was extremely important, whether it was in Japan or in Italy. Propaganda was extreme, or in Germany. In Germany, they had a ministry of propaganda, an entire ministry just on propaganda. Imagine having a ministry just devoted to that. And interestingly enough, a lot of people, of course, unless they research it, they have no reason to know this, but interestingly enough, they used tactics from Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue is in New York City. It's historically the area where there are a lot of firms, there are a lot of companies where they do advertising companies and marketing for corporations, and actually the governments learn propaganda. And some of the masterful propaganda comes out of the 1920s, by the way, which the Nazis later used in the 1930s, out of New York. Masterful propaganda. Linking marketing. There was a guy, I believe his name was Joseph Barton, and he wrote this book that became a bestseller, linking capitalism to Christianity and making it some kind of a holy mission to pursue riches, as though, by the way, Jesus Christ owned nothing. I mean, as though as though Christianity is all about wealth accumulation, which is amazing, but the marketing skills of the private sector become the propaganda tools of the state in the interwar period. And Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, Hitler's right-hand man, who was a masterful propagandist, had people working for him who put this into effect. And when I was doing, interestingly enough, when I was writing on Latin America, the various publications, I kept finding in government archives material where the Third Reich and Mussolini had sent people to Latin American countries, governments, to teach them how to be more effective propagandists. They had sent propagandists to other countries. So they were spreading their propaganda skills on a world scale. To say nothing of Europe, obviously, they literally covered Europe. And so projecting an image was very important to the fascists, by the way, very important. And making sure, I want to stress this point, making sure that that regime was the norm. That you can't think of an alternative, that it's either us or Bolshevik communism up in Mother Russia's, Joseph Stalin's Russia. What do you want? Do you want them or us? So this dichotomy of it's us or them, we, of course, are with the capitalists. They are no private property, communists, atheists. So what do you want? So they played on the cultural fears and the social fears and the political fears of people. Now, do the neoliberals have that kind of sophistication? Actually, they're even better at it, in my view. I have an entire chapter. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Before we move into the present era of neoliberals, I have to ask you about, you said that fascism and, the fascists and the Nazis were spreading their propaganda. Uh, don't you think, I'm not trying to be controversial, but, from if we try to see things from a broader point of view, don't you think that these things are related to the Zionism and the Zionist ideology?
Yes, thank you. I think I completely okay. I had completely forgotten that. In fact, I have a few
And
notes here.
I want to
I'll
make
even
sure
show
one.
you.
I
I
want to
have
make
even
sure one
written
thing.
it
It is
down.
not being. We are not trying to spread any hate. We are not trying to spread any
No,
racism. Not at all. We are
no,
trying to talk from a perspective where we are trying to
just the
understand
facts.
things.
Yes, yes. Assad, thank you for bringing that up. I, in fact, had marked it down. I had, in fact, the only thing I had marked down, Albert Einstein and Zionism. Thank you. Okay, good. That's an excellent point. Um, it is interesting that, first of all, the Zionist state um, uh, is in fact immersed in neoliberal policies. A few years ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., I attended a lecture by a Jewish scholar who was arguing that the way we should understand modern day Zionism is in its neoliberal context and its aggressiveness. He was arguing um, stems in part because of the neoliberal quest to enrich certain interests and those interests behind them uh, that support it. Now, in the 1920s and the 1930s, during the age of fascism and Nazism, as you point out, and the age where propaganda, I mean, in Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote while he was in prison, by the way, um, he elaborated extensively on how to use propaganda and to indoctrinate the population so that they can be with you. And it doesn't matter what they believe, they have to be convinced that you are right and they're wrong, whatever they believe. That was the era when Zionism was, it had already started in the 1890s, but it was molded a lot more and heavily influenced by fascism and Nazism. Albert Einstein, because I love Albert Einstein. I think he made enormous contributions. And Albert Einstein, who was a socialist, by the way, not a Bolshevik, he did not support Bolshevik communism, certainly not the Stalinist regime, had somewhat a little bit better view of Lenin and Trotsky, but certainly not a Stalinist, but a socialist. He did meet with Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the Zionist movement. And he had talks with him, and he had met with other Zionists in this period. Here's the thing with Einstein and the Zionist movement, and this is controversial today because a lot of people, ever since this genocidal war in Gaza, a lot of people have written about this in journalism, especially. But even scholarly articles have appeared. To what degree is Zionism so close to, well, Einstein, who was Jewish, obviously, who had somewhat ambivalent views on the one hand on Zionism. On the one hand, he could see, yes, they're trying to do something good because we're headed for a disaster. And of course, they were heading for a disaster. He was right. And he knew very well that the Christians, not the Muslims, the Christians, for 1,000 years had discriminated against Jews, European Jews. Okay, European Jews, by the way, coexisted in the Iberian Peninsula as long as the Muslims were there, as long as the Caliphate was there. Because the Muslims respected religious rights.
Exactly.
Once the Muslims were expelled by the Christians majority and they took over, that's when you see those people who want to study up on this, when you read about this, you see a mass exodus of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula coming to the Ottoman Empire, going up to the Russian Empire and settling in southern Russia, especially in Ukraine, by the way, modern day Ukraine today, but going up through, through the Balkans. Greece had a number of Jews. The Third Reich eliminated during the Holocaust most of them, but going up to that era, and also in the Middle East, by the way. So there is that reality. Einstein knew that. So he figured, okay, they're trying to establish some kind of an entity. On the other hand, he kept cautioning the Zionists that unless the Jews coexist peacefully, constructively with Muslims in the Middle East, where they intended to go back, they have learned nothing from their own history, from the history of the Jewish diaspora, the Jews throughout the European continent. So what Einstein was warning also, that what this Zionism meant for, in many respects, is that some of the worst traits of the European ideologies were picked up by Zionists. social Darwinism, which meant supremacy, by the way. It's a social Darwinism is a supremacist ideology based on race. They learned militarism, ultranationalism, all of these ingredients in the mix of Nazism. And of course, many Jews lived in Nazi Germany and in occupied France and in Austria. And they learn from all of this. I had a German, if I may, I had a German Jewish professor in Chicago who um, was telling us, I remember, he later became a friend and a colleague. He said that his parents were telling him they were, children during the Holocaust, during the 1930s, actually. They escaped the Holocaust. That they remembered other children when there were Nazi youth. By the way, the fascists and the Nazis had youth movements. This is one of the characteristics. They focused on the young, indoctrinating the young. When the Nazi youth were passing by the Jewish neighborhoods in protest against the Jews who were living in those neighborhoods, he said his parents had told him that some of the Jewish kids wanted to join in. They were they were carried away. They had no idea what was going on. They were carried away by the parade. The Jewish identity, the Jewish mindset from Poland, from Germany, from Western Europe was molded during the interwar period. Everybody has to remember when they came, by the way, to Palestine. They did not come in the 1970s. They came right out of the fascist Nazi era, the totalitarian era of the interwar period, and settled during no one would take during the Holocaust. No one would take them in the world, including the United States, by the way. But they did. Well, they were welcomed in Palestine, and so the mindset was molded. Now, having said that, the Holocaust was one of the world's greatest tragedies. It's without a doubt, and as Einstein pointed out, unless we learn to coexist, again, he came from a socialist background, unless we learn to coexist with our neighbors, and he was concerned about where Zionism was headed. Again, he had said positive things about it because he was concerned about what was happening in Europe. He was well aware of what the Germans were doing, but he was also not blind to the fact that they were right-wing, ultra-right-wing. And they turned out to be master propagandists. I mean, you have to take your hat off to some of the propaganda that comes out of Zionism, and you have to wonder how. Obviously, it's toward the evil end, because destroying your fellow human beings is evil. It's just immoral. It's very simple. But yes, Zionism came out of the context of the totalitarian era. It came out of this movement. Yes, go ahead.
But Mr. Kofus, doesn't Zionism precede these philosophies, these ideologies that emerged during the war? Because Zionism existed in the 19th century. Theodore Herzl presented it, and in fact, it existed even before Herzl. So you're saying that it developed from the interwar totalitarianism, but it emerged in the 19th century. So don't you think that it preceded it?
Yeah, Zionism starts with Theodor Herzl in the 19th century. Now we have to remember that the late 19th century that molded Theodor Herzl, okay, we have to remember his own background, the age of new imperialism, militarism, nationalism. So we have to remember that Zionism comes out of the age of imperialism. I've noticed, by the way, worldwide there are articles, journal articles, and others who point out, well, the reason that that Western countries, United States, UK, France, Germany support the state of Israel is because the state of Israel is doing what they were doing. They're colonialist, imperialist, militarist powers. Well, the fact is that the movement itself was born out of this environment. If one studies the environment from which the late 19th century, I mean, I mentioned the interwar period because that one really molded the kind of behavior in leading up to 1948, which by the way, they would use terrorist acts to become a state. Let's not mince words here. So what we have here is a movement born in the European context, out of European imperialism, out of European social Darwinism, out of Europe, and fascism itself, by the way, is an ideology. The roots of both Italian fascism and German Nazism are late 19th century. A lot of people don't realize. I remember when I was in graduate school, my French history professor said it was a seminar, and we all had to do a major essay for the course. And he said to me, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I really don't have any idea." It was about France. And he said, "How about the French contributions to fascist ideology?" And Maurice Barré was one of the ideologists, an obscure figure, obviously, but I mean, not for the French, but for the rest of the world. And then I did, and it's interesting. And when I started researching and doing the paper, it's just amazing that the ideas. This is much earlier than World War One. So yeah, of course, these people were molded. The Zionist movement was molded out of the European cultural, political context of the far right, of imperialism. Imperialism is not a nice thing. It means domination and exploitation of other people beyond your borders for your own profit and your own glory. It's a bad thing. It's morally repugnant. And it does result in mass destruction at the expense of the other on the receiving end. And it's interesting, by the way. I want to give you another aside here. When I did this book on Colombia in Latin America, and I said to some colleagues, my approach in this, I'm going to approach it from the perspective of Colombia rather than the United States, which was after its oil. And of course, it deprived, a lot of people don't know this, but Panama didn't exist. Panama was actually part of Colombia. The US created Panama as a separate country so it can, take the canal. Anyway, and they said, that's an interesting perspective. It's not, it's very unconventional. Why would you do this is back in the early 80s, why would you do a book looking at the foreign policy I said, well, why wouldn't you look at this from the perspective of the victim? And the victim is not the hegemonic power, the imperialist power. The victim is on the other side. And so and I'm mentioning this because a lot of people in the world, by the way, take it for granted that the hegemon has powers. Just last night, this was in the news this morning, a U.S. congressman suggested using nuclear bombs in Gaza. This guy's from Michigan. The way the U.S. used them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in August 1945. So, and people, I have no doubt that there is a large segment of the population that feels, yeah, we have the right to do that. Not a war crime, although all the victims, civilians, use it. It's as though the situation in Gaza is not bad enough as it is, a genocidal war, a forced famine, on top of that, nuke them. As though they're saying, let's just go have a cup of coffee. I mean, that's the sort of thing. In other words, when you look at it, not just from a perspective, an analytical perspective of a historian or political scientist, but you also look at the psychology, the political psychology of this. What's fascinating about this is that a segment of the population figure, well, this is the norm. You know, this is what a power does. A great power does. And they have, they have the right to do this. And it reminds me, one of the greatest historians ever in the history of civilization, one of my ancestors from ancient Athens, when he wrote against the Athenians, although he was an Athenian general, during the Peloponnesian War, and he looked at a neutral country, not Sparta, which was an enemy of Athens, but a neutral country on a small island called Milos. In the Melian dialogue, he has the people of the island asking the Athenians, why are you destroying us? Are you resolved in destroying us? And don't allow us to be neutral. We're not taking anybody's side. And the answer of the Athenians is because we have the power to do that. And so Thucydides, the historian, whom, by the way, college students study all over the world because of the methodology that he applied. The historian was trying to say that might makes right. And this is 2,500 years ago, and it's still today. We, like the Michigan congressman last night, we have the bombs, let's use them, let's nuke them, without any regard to the population. This sort of thinking, by the way, is not that different from the sort of thinking that prevailed when Mussolini used mustard gas in Ethiopia, which decomposes human flesh. It's a chemical that's very deadly. Chemical warfare is a very nasty type of warfare. It was used in part during the Vietnam War. So you have this blasé attitude because people are indoctrinated. Well, we have the right because we have the power. This kind of arrogance, which the Zionists do have with regard to the situation in Palestine, but notice they go self-defense, right? Self-defense to the point of dropping nuclear weapons, as they didn't suggest it. The congressman from Michigan suggested it. Self-defense to that, what? They're children, women, and men. What self-defense is that? Anyway, that is also an outgrowth of the interwar period. The Zionist movement is an outgrowth of the interwar period. They come out of that with that European molding, that European mentality. And the Europeans, by the way, were no strangers. I mean, fascism is just a continuity of history. History doesn't work in terms of compartments. This is a logical outgrowth of what the Europeans were doing. Because you mentioned, well, Zionism came out of the era of new imperialism in the late 90s. Of course it did. So did fascism and Nazism. You know, if you look at the heroes of Mussolini, personally, of Mussolini and Hitler, they were 19th century people. You see, because human beings, we exist in time. We exist in time, and we're conditioned. We've talked about this in the past. You know, we're conditioned by our environment. They were conditioned by their environment. So naturally, it stands to reason that Zionists were conditioned by it. And to his credit, Albert Einstein was alarmed by some of the things he saw. And privately, in letters that were later published and are part of his archive, this is revealed that we're not sure where these people are going, that we have to watch them. You know, he was very careful about where he knew that they were molded by fascism and Nazism. Go ahead. I talked too long about this, I know. I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay, Mr. Kofos, you were just proceeding towards the 21st century neoliberalism, and you were talking about how
Yes.
this totalitarianism is impacting the neoliberal era of today's world. And I had to interrupt you. I apologize for that, but it was very important to discuss about these things and how these
No,
things are
and
unfortunately
I agree, and I
impacting.
thank you. I thank you for stopping, because I had it in a couple of notes. I had written it down. I meant to talk about it. I went off on other things, but no, that's very important. That's a very important, because it's happening right now with devastating consequences. And by the way, we still have no idea where this is going. I don't know where it's going. I have no idea where it's headed. Um, one hopes for the best, but we don't know where it's going. It's still ongoing. You know. Anyway, let me talk about the 21st aspects. The one of the things that scholars point out, as well as very good journalists on neoliberalism and fascism and the parallels, is the concentrated power of the executive branch of government. When there is a government where there is division and separation of powers, in other words, there is a balance of power within the government, and the legislative branch, as John Locke, the father of liberalism in the 17th century, pointed out, if the legislative branch is stronger, and in a liberal democracy, it always must be, according to Locke, so that the rights of people are safeguarded, then things are fine. However, what happens if there is a switch to the executive branch, to the president or prime minister, and the executive branch assumes autocratic powers? And that is where I focus in my book, and that's where a lot of people focus when they try to compare fascism, the interwar fascism, with neoliberalism. What has happened in the last 40 years is that the executive branch of governments worldwide, even in democratic government, for example, France, under Macron, today, that government, the executive branch, has assumed greater powers. Um, he constantly criticizes Marine Le Pen, who is the neo-fascist rival to his government. But the fact is, he has moved to the far right. He has strengthened the executive branch. When the executive branch strengthens that far, um, that much, there is alarm that the government's becoming dictatorial. Now, Donald Trump, in his pre-election, this is right now, in his pre-election speech, not in 2016, but in this campaign that he's carrying out to become president in this November in 2024, has stated that he will strengthen the executive branch even more, that he will concentrate powers even more. That is a very dangerous route. And herein rests the parallels with interwar fascism. Now, Hitler moved very rapidly to consolidate power at the executive branch and became a full-fledged dictator within a few months. Mussolini moved gradually, by the way. He moved step by step. But they did the exact same thing. They concentrated power in the executive. So no one would check them. The legislative branch became increasingly weaker. And so one of the dangers here is exactly this. Now, having said this, the fact is that the legislative branches, let's take the United States, the legislative branch of the United States goes along with the executive anyway. I mean, it's the legislative, sometimes they're worse than the executive branch, just as we witnessed last night, a congressman from Michigan advocating nuking Gaza, for Christ's sakes. I mean, if that's not a crime, I don't know what is. So it's not that the executive branch, the legislative branch, sorry, is made up of angels, and that if you have a legislative, just because it exists, that means there will be a balance of power, because there is a concept in political science in the United States which has a two-party system, which is called uniparty. In other words, the U.S. is really one party. It's one political system, and the two parties differ on cultural issues. They differ on some social issues. It's identity politics and abortion and so forth and so on. On feminism and those issues. But that is a very important issue. And that is a parallel between the fascist ideology and neoliberalism. The other thing that is important to note is what is happening in the criminal justice system and the judicial branch. There is something alarming when the judicial branch, which also is supposed to check the powers of the legislative and the executive branch, when the judicial branch is also part of the consensus and goes along with authoritarian policies, and promotes such policies, then we have a problem. In some countries worse than others. In the case of the United States, of course, the justices of the Supreme Court and the judges in the courts of appeals tend to be they're appointed, and they are basically carrying out the agenda of the executive anyway. So my point is that in the current neoliberal system, the facade is democratic. In domestic governance structure and in foreign policy, oh, we're democratic, and they go out of their way to stress that they're democratic. And then going back to the Arbatov thesis, we're going to deprive you of an enemy. Then they use other countries, accusing them of being authoritarian, never self-examining the level of authoritarianism and the aspects of fascist traits within their own system and the absence of social justice within their own countries. This is very significant. Using the term, it's very cheap propaganda, by the way, public relations trick, to keep saying, well, Trump was famous for that. We're the greatest country in the world's history. We're the greatest democratic country in the world's history. Well, okay, what does that mean that the United States is the greatest democratic country? When you look at the rising inequality in the United States from 1980 to the present, when you look at the social justice index, just this morning, by the way, I saw a video of homelessness in the United States. It is unbelievable. The level of homelessness that exists, especially in the great state of California, one of my favorite states. I love California. And the solution that some of the right-wing neoliberals propose, the solution they propose is collecting these people and getting them out of there, getting them out of the sidewalks. They have no place to go, by the way. Getting them out so that the real estate value can go up. In other words, there is stigma to them. There is stigma for the real estate value. Never mind the fact that these people have no place to go. Never mind that they were let out of mental institutions. Many of them have problems with alcoholism, drug abuse, the mental instability, and so forth. Never mind doing something constructive for this population, including, by the way, finding work for them. The way that in the 1930s, the FDR administration, not a socialist administration, Keynesian, I have to point that out. A lot of people, when they hear of FDR, they mean, oh, he was a socialist. He was a Keynesian, a millionaire, by the way. Both he and his wife were millionaires. They believed in capitalism, but they had a social safety net. Neoliberals, no social safety net, punish the poor for being poor, as though they created the conditions of poverty, as though the system didn't create them. This is fascist thinking. Punish the victims of poverty and to deal in the way that they're proposing to deal with them. One other thing I want to mention, very important, I have it here. I see it in my notes, that I wanted to mention is the Great Recession of 2008, which was global, by the way. It starts with the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2007. It spreads to the Wall Street banks and to the investment firms, from Goldman Sachs to JP Morgan. And it takes down the entire stock market by 2008. By September 2008, it was crisis. Then China begins to panic. Obviously, the factory to the world, China. And thank God that it was there to pump up the economy and to pump money into a number of economies, including the US, to re-stimulate. But the crisis of 2008, a lot of people don't realize now. It's almost 20 years. This is 2024. In 4 more years we'll have the 20th anniversary. The crisis of 2008 exacerbated authoritarianism. It's no coincidence that many authoritarian governments emerged after, including in the United States, including in India, by the way, including in Hungary, and many of the right-wing parties in Europe emerged after, including Bolsonaro in Brazil, they emerged after the crisis of 2008. So the neoliberal elites, this is one of the things that I stressed in my own research in the forthcoming book on neoliberalism. The elites become even more determined to amass capital because they realize there is a crisis. God forbid they take lesser profit amid this crisis. So government bails them out, which means huge public debt, because that money is borrowed, right? So government bails them out to the tune of trillions. Government goes sky high. Inequality remains high and goes even higher. And those are conditions that are not that different from what happened in Europe coming out of World War One, going into the 1920s. And then let me point out that the economic crisis right out of the war, the transition from the war economy to the civilian economy when the war ends, was very shocking for the Europeans. And Italy was the first victim. And then right after the Great Depression, right after the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression is really what brought Hitler to power. There is no doubt, if there were no Great Depression, Hitler would never have come to power. Hitler tried, by the way, in 1923, down in Bavaria, in southern Germany. He tried to take over. He was arrested and put in prison. The coup failed. He was put in prison. That's where he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, the title of his book, where he talks a lot about propaganda and how the role of government is to appeal to people's emotion, not to their intellect, not to their thinking, rational thought process, but to get them emotionally hooked. This is very important, that two economic crises back to back, in 1919 and then in 1929, bring to power more authoritarianism in Europe. And in Japan, by the way, Japan was also part of that group. Brazil was also part of that, in that same category. So you have economic crisis leading toward authoritarian regimes. I see the political future, unfortunately, headed more in that direction in the next downturn. I don't think we are headed for more democratic and social justice based governments, unfortunately. Um, excuse me, all signs are that the world is headed toward more authoritarianism and more traits of fascism, while keeping the label of democracy, but within the label of democracy, pursuing policies that are not that different from fascist policies, at the very least authoritarian, some fascist. And when you have leaders who use the strategies of previous fascist dictators and authoritarian dictators, and even the language that they use, that's alarming in itself. Okay, I'm gonna pause right there and ask you to ask me. I guess I've been going for an hour and a half. I got ask you if you have any questions to conclude all of this. So what? Assad, are you there? I guess I have lost you. Okay, let me then make a couple of concluding remarks, and then maybe we can get Assad back. I think that the lessons of the interwar period of fascism and Nazism, considered, it is true that no country resembles Nazi Germany in our lifetime today, although clearly there are countries that where repression of the minority population is so extreme that they are alarming, and the United Nations, I don't need to point out the countries, the United Nations has reports on those, and the United Nations has provided plenty of evidence on what these countries are all about and what they're doing and how close they are to pursuing authoritarian policies. I think that the political systems of our time are headed toward a right-wing course. There are very, very few countries where we don't have right-wing um, right-wing elements of right-wing politics. Even in democratic countries, claiming, like France, for example, England, there are elements of right-wing politics. And this is alarming because it is the erosion of social justice in society. And it also means that the uh, that other countries uh, that have diplomatic relations with authoritarian countries are impacted. So the impact of an authoritarian country is not only limited to its own citizens, but it's international, unfortunately. There is an alternative to this. It's the alternative of popular democracy um, and social justice. This may sound idealistic, but I would rather have an idealistic goal than to accept as the norm perpetual repression. Well, that's it for today, and I thank everyone for listening, and I hope we continue the discussion on another topic, similar topic, at another time. Bye bye.